So my name is Mikel Renca. I'm a sixth-year doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology here at Boston University. And I also have a bachelor's degree in religious studies and English from St. Michael's College in Colchester, Vermont. I actually just finished 16 months of dissertation fieldwork in South Central Java, which is part of the Republic of Indonesia. My fieldwork was graciously funded through the Fulbright-Hays program, and it was in support of my dissertation, which looks at questions of identity and belonging for Javanese Muslims. And so this actually built in a lot of ways on about a decade for me of study, work, and later research in Indonesia. As an undergrad, I actually studied abroad in Yogyakarta in Java. And then after I graduated, I ended up doing an English teaching experience in an Islamic boarding school in West Java with the Fulbright program. And so through these experiences and some other travel back and forth, largely to Java, I ended up building a lot of relationships with Indonesians, and in particularly Javanese Muslim friends who share a diversity of views about Islam and Java. So through my many conversations with them, it started to spark a lot of the questions that then built or then became part of my dissertation fieldwork. So that's just a little bit about my background and maybe how it ties in a little bit into my research. My project, my dissertation, thinks about how Muslims who are, what I would say, is outside the pious Sunni mainstream in Java, how they negotiate identity and belonging at multiple sociological scales, including communally and nationally. So during my fieldwork, I spent a lot of time hanging out with Javanese members of communities called paguyuban in rural villages in South Central Java. So paguyuban, this is a word that basically means community, and it was a community in the village that was focused on the embodiment and kind of passing down of values, practices, and ways of knowing from their ancestors. Now, pious Sunni religious authorities in Indonesia, they've largely erased paguyuban members from state-authorized narratives about Islam in Indonesia. So a lot of times, from my interviews with pious Sunnis, they would often say to me that paguyuban members do not practice Islam correctly because they don't subscribe to pious practices that are kind of bound by the Sharia or Islamic law. And so for this reason, a lot of my contacts in the paguyuban, they faced some pretty significant social stigmas, right? Claims from pious Sunnis and others in society that they were, for example, primitive or animistic, or that somehow their practices were backwards. What I found is that my contacts were largely Sufi Muslim. So my contacts were largely Sufi Muslims, but they were Sufis who held in tension their Sufism with a sense of themselves as indigenous persons. So this became a way in which they would negotiate identity and belonging in a society, again, in which many Muslim authorities insist that to be a proper Muslim, one needs to conform to pious practices like Salat prayer, right? A lot of Muslims around the world will pray 5 times a day, will do the Salat prayer 5 times a day. Another important kind of distinction that pious Sunnis would make is the study of Islamic scriptures in Arabic. Now, my contacts were mostly unlettered Muslims, so they didn't read Arabic. But interestingly, in Indonesia has a citizenship ID card, and there's a religion column on that ID card. So my contacts, they would put Islam on their ID card, and this secured them a basic degree of legitimacy, right? So they could move through everyday life. You have to show your ID card a lot in Indonesia. So as they moved through everyday life, people wouldn't necessarily be able to distinguish that they were not pious Sunnis, right? And so this, again, it allowed them to avoid a certain amount of scrutiny that, for example, pious Sunnis might often direct towards non-Muslim minorities in Indonesia. My contacts, to a certain degree, didn't have to deal with that. But privately, they would push back against Sunni claims, pious Sunni claims, to kind of define the terms of belonging to the Muslim community. And they would do that by articulating, again, a sense of themselves as indigenous persons. So I can offer a kind of brief example of this. I had one of my interlocutors or friends in Java, his name was Pradipta, right? And Pradipta talked with me about the distinction that he saw between the notion of Islamic law or Sharia and what he called hakikat. And for Pradipta, hakikat is a Sufi principle, right? And this is true actually around in many parts of the world. It's a kind of deeper knowledge about God and humans' relationship with God. And so with the hakikat, my friend Pradipta would say that the hakikat is not bound to the kind of strictures or principles of Islamic law, right? But Pradipta actually went a little bit further than that. And so he would say that his ancestors, prior to the coming of Muslim missionaries from India to Java in the 14th century, had an understanding of hakikat that they expressed through the ways in which they treated one another. So values like love, humility, respect between members of these paguyuban, or between members of the communities that his ancestors lived in during that time, really embodied the kind of value that is expressed by the principle of hakikat. And in particular, I want to stress this value of love, which is very important for many Sufis. Sufis often practice zikr, which is kind of a recitation of litanies that have to do with the names and qualities of God, right? And so through zikr, in certain communal contexts, one kind of cultivates this intimate relationship with the divine. And so this was a big part of the community that Pradipta participated in the paguyuban. They often recited zikr. But Pradipta would again say that pious Sunnis might claim that my ancestors did not practice Islam, that they didn't even practice religion, but in fact, they knew the hakikat. And so in that way, they understood and practiced a version of Islam that might not have been the Sharia Islam that the missionaries brought. But for Pradipta, it was important to understand that this was kind of an equally respectable way to be a good Muslim, right? And that for him, the Sharia in a lot of ways was a kind of a practice that many people could easily adopt, but the hakikat was a kind of a deeper kind of knowledge, right, that in some ways went beyond the Sharia. And so I kind of look at this as a sort of subversion. And so I would say that a lot of my context in the paguyuban would kind of subvert dominant Sunni claims about belonging as a Muslim in Indonesia through these kinds of explanations. And so that, in a nutshell, is what I'm looking at in my dissertation. Frankly, one of the inspiring things about being in Java is just the incredible amount of diversity even just within the Muslim community. And so really it could, from village to village, there could be some distinctions, right, between the ways that people understood concepts like indigenous personhood, for example, and how people expressed their sense of belonging to the Muslim community. But I would say that generally these themes kind of held, and especially for many of the paguyuban that are very influenced by Sufism, there were these senses, these ways of trying to think about identity and belonging, and distinguishing as well between kind of legal identity on one's ID card and a kind of deeper sense of personhood bound up with these values and ways of living in the world that maybe were not reflected on the ID card where that legal category simply said Islam, right? Well, I wish I could say that it was very unique, but I think there's an incredible amount of rich dialogue between anthropologists and Indonesians, including Javanese Indonesians, about Islam. And so I feel like I'm really joining a conversation that has an incredible amount of rich scholarship. And I'm trying to just clarify and kind of discuss some of the dynamics that I'm seeing in a way that I would hope is attentive to, again, hierarchies, power, who gets othered in Java, right, in the Muslim community. And so to me, it's really entering into a conversation and hoping to kind of talk about an experience. As I mentioned, I do have many friends over the years who participate in paguyuban in the Yogyakarta area, many of them, whom I met over the years, and they kind of introduced me and opened the doors for understanding the variety of expressions of Islam in Java. So that was kind of an introduction really a decade ago that has kind of spurred questions that now turned into this dissertation. It's a really exciting field, sociocultural anthropology. Ethnographic fieldwork is really the kind of in a lot of ways the focus of anthropology, and it grounds us, right? Because it's an invitation to engage with people in a particular location, in a particular place with an issue and a set of themes, right? And so it's typically driven by certain puzzles or questions that we might have read in the literature, but we're really going into a community or going into a place and doing what anthropologists call deep hanging out. So some people may say, wow, that seems like an informal method, but really it is the heart in a lot of ways of the ethnographic method. Anthropology has a more sophisticated term for it, participant observation, but many anthropologists enjoy framing it as deep hanging out. And so this is really about spending time with people, talking to people, learning about their struggles, their aspirations, their lived experiences, and building relationships, and then stepping back with the conversations that we've had, with the ethnographic data that we've collected, obviously with consent from people, and thinking about these in relation to certain sociocultural theories, right? And the theories are always in dialogue with our contacts and their lived experiences, but they're often also in dialogue with philosophy. They may be in dialogue as well with critical or literary theorists and other social scientists. So it's never fully removed from our contacts' lives, but it's allowing us to think with our contacts about these themes. There's an anthropologist, James Clifford, who talks about partial truths and reminds us that every anthropologist brings a certain positionality, right? So I, grew up in northern Vermont, and I'm studying at Boston University, right? But I'm traveling to Indonesia, to Java, and I'm having conversations with Javanese Indonesians, members of paguyuban communities, right? And so I can never tell the full story, right? But I can share a certain perspective informed by my positionality, a partial truth, in Clifford's words, that is entering into a conversation with other scholars and certainly with other Javanese members of paguyuban and other Indonesians, right, about these issues. So I find that really exciting, and I find that really true in a lot of ways about what ethnographic research and what anthropology is trying to contribute. And Clifford's talking as well about ethnographic writing. One of the interesting things about anthropology too, there's a famous anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, right, who actually has done research in Indonesia as well and published widely, but Geertz talks about thick description. And this is something that I also really enjoy about anthropology, where anthropologists, when they're writing ethnographic vignettes or ethnographic or ethnography, right, it's a genre, it's the kind of the central genre in a lot of ways of anthropology, bringing in these rich descriptions of what anthropologists heard and saw, what we experienced, right, what we felt, helps to ground readers. And as long as it's done in ways that avoid certain stereotypes, right, it can really allow readers to be in our shoes and more deeply understand the complexities of issues in the communities that we engaged with. So thick description is something that I think many ethnographies do very, very well, and American anthropology in a lot of ways has really kind of taken up Geertz's invitation. So I would say that that's another aspect of anthropology I really enjoy. One other thing I would say is sociocultural anthropology really forces anthropologists to engage with so many topics. As a doctoral student, I'm not just focused on my dissertation topic. We take classes on ethics, emotions. We take classes on ethnicity, identity, belonging, religion. So we have to have this breadth of knowledge. And maybe it's not as narrow and as deep as we go with our dissertation, but it forces us to kind of have this broad toolkit. And I think that, again, prepares us to go into the field and think about the complexity of people's lived experiences, which oftentimes involve various dimensions of the things that we've learned through our courses. So in a nutshell, those are some of the things that excite me about sociocultural anthropology. As an anthropologist, I always try to think about these questions in a grounded way in relation to the communities that I've had conversations with. So in a lot of ways, I try to think about living together in difference through my ethnographic fieldwork, through my research. And I think I've kind of spoken to some of those themes around how in different social contexts you can have hierarchies of belonging, right? You can have ways in which people strategically subvert or negotiate identity and belonging. And I think one thing that anthropologists can do is bring more awareness, right, through various formats and forums, right, through the ethnographic genre, right, through conversations. There's a whole dimension of anthropology called public anthropology that attempts to bring a lot of the ivory tower discourses. Frankly, some of anthropology can be very, very theoretical, right, and tries to bring that into the public domain, into the public sphere, and ground it in a way that people can understand and can participate in. And I think those are difficult challenges, but the more anthropologists lean into these practices, I think, and the more anthropologists are in dialogue with people, the more we see the diversity of lived experiences, and we can think about the similarities and differences of people's lived experiences around the world. So I have learned a lot about CURA participating in the colloquium this year. And again, I'm so honored to be able to speak with so many distinguished scholars from Boston University and the surrounding Boston community, as well as other graduate students in anthropology and other related disciplines in the social sciences and humanities who are doing incredible work. I deeply admire the interdisciplinary dimension, the multidisciplinary dimension of CURA. When I read my fellow colloquium members' working papers, I'm forced to think about similar issues that I'm thinking about or working on in different ways through their lens and through their disciplinary lens. And I think that's a really rich dialogue that then opens up through our conversations, and it enhances my work, and I imagine the work of everyone who is in these colloquiums year in and year out, because it allows for this dialogue about similarities and also differences in terms of methodology, in terms of what we're reading, what we're seeing, and yet it's grounded in this kind of conversation about world affairs and also religion. So we have a little bit of a kind of guiding light in terms of the general, the general trajectory of our conversations. I also deeply appreciate some of the programs that CURA runs. I would like to express again my gratitude. One of the programs that CURA runs is a travel grant program. And over the summer, I was able to use some of the funds from CURA's travel grant to do research in Jakarta, archival research for a couple months in the National Archives and also the National Library. As you can imagine, many graduate students work on a shoestring budget. So I was deeply grateful to be able to receive some financial assistance in order to do that research, which I hope will really enhance my dissertation. So again, I think these opportunities, these programs that CURA runs are really, really important for graduate students who are trying to get on their feet and trying to do this kind of field work or research. One other aspect of CURA that I'd like to highlight is its multimedia dimension, I think is a good way to put it. I notice CURA has a great website. This interview program is also another excellent example, but I noticed that CURA also produced a multimedia series. It's called Indonesian Pluralities. And this was a kind of collaboration between anthropologists at Boston University and anthropologists and other scholars at the University of Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. And I really appreciated this. It's a 6-part series that talks about sociocultural and religious diversity and some of the social tensions and challenges about living in Indonesia in the 21st century. But something that impressed me so much about this series was that CURA produced it in collaboration with the Luce Foundation and also the University of Gadjah Mada in Indonesian and also in English. And these are really rich films. I mean, the cinematography is really, really well done. And it opens a certain window, I think, for Americans who might not know much about Indonesia. And then a different window in different ways for Indonesians who obviously know a lot more to kind of think about many of the experiences, many of the challenges that maybe they also face in everyday life. So I think this kind of approximates the public anthropology aspect of my discipline that I really find to be productive And I'm so excited that CURA has been able to, or the Pardee School has been able to help fund that. So those are just a couple things that I wanted to highlight about CURA and about the Pardee School that I think are really remarkable.